Hi, my name is Benedict. This video is interesting. Maybe some of you will think not relevant, and that's fine. What I've done, and I didn't set out to do this initially, but I realized, hey, it was probably a way to go, was I ended up comparing, three different DAWs, and even one DAW against itself, with regards to how I made the mix inside that DAW. So some of it was, do the DAWs sound different? Do the DAWs lead you to do something different? And do you end up behaving differently because the situation's different? And also, is there one right way to make a mix? Because I very much am not a believer in there being the one right way to make a mix, in that a song is a story, as you always hear me talk about, and there are various different ways to express that story. You know, we can tell the Robin Hood story from the perspective of Robin Hood and assume that's the only way we could still tell that story, but we could tell that story from the perspective of Little John, of Friar Tuck, of Maid Marian. There's no reason why that we couldn't tell it from the perspective of the Sheriff of Nottingham, or even from a deer in the forest, or a random peasant in a village, even a random peasant in a village in Italy. They're all possible ways to tell the Robin Hood story. So let's have a look. We started with writing a track called Sun After the Flood. I then took those stems and, to test something, made a mix in Tracktion Waveform. And then I made a mix in Reaper. And then I thought, these mixes do feel different from the mix that I made to start with, the official mix. And so I took those stems and put them back into Reason and said, okay, I'm going to mix them again. Because after having spent a day each, because it took me a long time struggling to get to use the software, after spending a day each in Tracktion's Waveform and Reaper, I wanted to see, how did it go, how did it feel to do the same thing again in Reason. And I've got to say, it happened so fast. So here's the original. So what you'll probably notice from that is that it's a very bright, busy, forward kind of a mix. Before you worry, every single sound in there is synthesis, including the acoustic guitars. It's all synthesis. Unashamedly so too. It's not a case of using them because I didn't want to use guitarists. It'd be lovely to have a guitarist come in and play this, especially for the more 12-string part over on the right, your right. But I work with what I've got and I'm happy with what I've got. So let's have a listen again to comparison of how they've come out. Original, this is the second one is the Reaper mix, the third is the Tracktion mix, and then the fourth is redoing it in Reason, so the Reason mix. I deliberately didn't try to make the sounds exactly the same. When I made the original track, I used the usual suspects in Reason. Of course, when I carried across to Tracktion and Reaper, I didn't have such immediate access to those same devices. So I had to make do, and I had no problem with that because that was part of the situation. What caused me to start looking at this was the fact that I've got a student who uses Pro Tools. I mean, poor guy using Pro Tools. No, I mean, Pro Tools is actually really good. I haven't used it for decades, but it is good. And I wanted to set him some homework where he had to go away and do a mix, and ideally bring that mix so that I could see it and see inside it as well. And of course, the problem is because I don't run Pro Tools, that was going to be hard. Yes, there's Pro Tools first, but I've looked at it and felt like it's probably just too limited to justify the effort of installing it and messing around with it. That's fine because it costs nothing, so it's a way to start to have a look at it. But buying Pro Tools and paying for it every month or what have you is just not what I want to do. So I had to look at other alternatives. Hence, Tracktion and Reaper. Cakewalk by BandLab was also a contender, but he's Apple afflicted. Poor guy. So the organ sound, if you listen to that, is quite different across the four pieces. That's rotor. That I think is Mars distortion, which I've got access to in everything. That was also Mars distortion, but treated differently. And then this one is polar. So rather than trying to duplicate my first mix when I was back in Reason, when I was re-reasoning it, I said, let's try a different approach and used polar. So you will hear a different feel, and that, of course, has a fair impact on how the mixes feel. That's quite a nice warm sound compared to the really bright forward sound that we've gotten out of the original soundtrack. Now here, moving off into the first main bit. Again, quite a different sound. Some of that's driven by the organ, some of that's driven by just I've come up with different balances of those parts, particularly I think around the organ and the guitars. And each time I've tried to get the right balance, what feels like the right balance between drums and bass. Now, drums were made in Kong using mostly the physically modelled drum heads and the synth hi-hat for cymbals and everything. So it's not pretending to be a real performance there. The drums went through Scream. So that Scream originally helping to tighten up those drums, and you hear a much tighter sound overall probably in the first Reason mix than in the later ones. There's a lot more body and belly in these other mixes. But back into Reason, it's a tighter sound. There isn't as much low end, and that's something that I noticed, that there was a warmer sound from the other DAWs, and I thought, is that something wrong with Reason? But it's just the way I tend to work. I tend to go for a brighter sound, and that means I tend to use quite a bit of high passing to clarify. And while it's great having this really warm sound, it can make for a muddy mix if you don't have nice speakers. Maybe I tend to clarify things too much at the moment and brightening the top end, because I'm working out better and better ways to brighten the top end and create more clarity. And with that, maybe I can allow more of that low end to stay. The drums in Reaper definitely went through the Mars distortion, and once I've gotten into headphones I can hear they were distorting too much. I was aware they were distorting a bit, but I didn't really have a problem with that. I wanted to drive them a bit. I've probably driven them a little too hard because I can hear just plain crunching distortion, and not in a cool way. In Tracktion, to be honest, I don't remember what I used to push the drive. It could well have been the Mars distortion again. Traction's inbuilt effects are, well, not very good. Not very good at all. Reaper's inbuilt effects are generally really quite good. Their EQ, the inbuilt EQ is really rather cool for an inbuilt EQ, and of course, bearing in mind it's very Reaper, which I find a pain in the ass to use. It's good. It's not a bad EQ at all. It's quite usable. Next part, we move. So we're showing off the guitars and a synth arpeggio. Lot more reverb in the Reaper mix. I did use the phaser, because while it was limited, if you hit the right spot, the phaser in Tracktion's waveform was kind of cool. One thing that I did like, and I think this is what drove me to use the pun, excuse the pun, with the Mars distortion in Reaper, in particular, there was how bright I could make that metal work. And I think I probably overdid it a bit, but it's kind of cool. It's nowhere near as dominant in the original, because I believe actually in hindsight I dropped the level. I automated the mix at that point, so it wasn't too dominant, but that didn't get done in the other versions. And we move to the Rotor really gives us a lovely B3 kind of sound, and the original sound is actually not an organ at all. It's a synth pad out of Europa. All the sounds were made within the piece. It didn't seem to serve the right purpose as a pad. It was a bit pointless, and something made me think, well, hang on, it's probably more like an organ. So I hit it with Rotor, and I got this great. In Reaper, it's nowhere near as clear. For the rotary speaker, the Leslie effect, I actually used one of my old VST creations. RS2 was a rotary speaker, quite clever. Split the signal into two drive units, top and bottom, and then two delay effects which pan for the speakers. So you can actually set them up at different rates. So your horn and speaker can rotate at different times from each other, which is not uncommon with Leslie's. The less perfect they were, then the more that they would actually get out of track with each other, which is part of the charm of the Leslie sound. It does make for a nice sound, but it's not the same as roto. You can hear the organ in Tracktion. It really doesn't have much happening in it at all, because in the original with rotor, and the same with my synth effect, I have the Leslie switch from slow to fast. A very common performance trait with B3 players, in that they will flick the rate at which their rotary is running between slow and fast, or even off, and that gives them a vibrato they can pull in and out. And the great players will switch them on and off quite a lot. The player for Huey Lewis and the News, he would do some lovely work with playing along and switching his Leslie in and out. In this case, it's polar. Polar running into Mars distortion again, because I'd used it a lot before. I thought, well, let's see how it's going to behave in this case. We don't get as dramatic an effect from it. It's still interesting, but it's not as noticeable at this point, which in a sense is a shame, and it's good. If you listen to the original, it's still quite an organ-driven piece at this point. There, the organ is very much in the background. I kept pulling it back for right or for wrong, but it's allowed the guitars to drive this piece much more than the organ. Now here we start to bring in a string. Out of all of them, I've got to say the fourth, the re-reason version, I've just got that string beautifully done as far as I'm concerned. It's because there's not as much organ, the string really just leaps out, and the string was an important part of the composition process. It's the sun appearing after the flood, Noah and all of that. So the idea of this rebirth, this new hope, needs to be grand, and I think I've got it far better in the last mix than I do in any of the others. To be honest, I was really struggling in the other DAWs, in Reaper and Tracktion, to get the string to come alive. I was struggling with a lot of the sounds to make them come alive. It's not because there's anything wrong with the sound of the other DAWs. I just found them very, very obtuse to work with. Overly complex routings. It might give you lots of options, but oddly enough fewer options in reality, but it just feels too complex to work with, whereas Reason, I don't need to insert an EQ because I've got one. There's one already there. So all kinds of things like that are just there and easy to use, and very visible in Reason. Like, you can see everything that's happening in Reason. In this case, if I've got that open, I can see that happening. Now, there isn't anything else happening to any of the other mixes, but the Tracktion Waveform mix didn't get mastered, and so to make it a fair comparison, I've just upped the level and put it through a limiter. It's a simpler version of things that I've done with the others, but that's very visible, really easy to see. I just wasn't showing it here, but in Tracktion and Reaper and most DAWs, the problem is that everything's hidden. You get a nice looking mixer with these pretty looking faders, But the problem is then you can't actually see anything. Yes, you can see a little matrix, like an Excel spreadsheet of plugins that you've got, but you can't see any of what's there. And I know some of those DAWs are looking to try to bring that out, and some of them, like Cakewalk, have gotten into the Pro channel thing, and Cubase is doing the same thing. They're putting these channel strip VST type things and welding it into their basic thing. But Reason doesn't need to, because you've already got this wonderful mixer with these channels, real channels, like an SSL. So I think that I was struggling, particularly in those DAWs, to find a way to really bring these sounds out. Here, there, it's quite buried. I managed to get it to go better. I was a bit more confident with that approach to a DAW when I was using Tracktion Second. But while originally it was still quite an organ-driven mix, and I knew what I wanted the string to do, but I didn't allow it to really come forward the way that it has. These mixes. So having done it again and having gone through various different processes, it has been interesting to redo, to re-image some of what's happening in the mix. Now, I talked before about different profiles of how it sounds. So we'll pop ourselves back here. Oh, if you've at all wondered about a slight oddness in the construction outside of sounds and what have you, for some bizarre reason I ended up using a 5-bar pattern, not a 4-bar pattern. It was technically an error, but I liked what I got, so I ran with it. You'll see with those that there's not much happening here. And in many ways that's good, because it means that you can get a brighter, clearer mix. It's much bigger up here, so it's easy to say that it's a warmer, fatter sound. The problem I have with that is that overall the sound isn't as nice. There isn't the clarity. It's not what I would call a beautiful, clear mix. Yes, you can say it's warm, but that doesn't mean that we're getting the detail out of it. That one, the kick really is quite dominant. The bass is much more dominant in this one. So again, it's not entirely fair to say that one's better than the other, simply because in some cases the kick's more dominant and in others the bass is more dominant. It is interesting when you look at these that you do see more extension up here. There's more extension in both ends than there is in Reason. Now, I'm not sure where that is. It may simply be because of how I master. I may be tending to get rid of some of that to clarify or warm the mix. Exactly why, I'm not sure, but it is interesting that you see that difference. The brighter sounding mix doesn't have quite as much energy up here, which is proof that you don't need tons of treble to get a bright mix. But we do have a lot of gap down here. To be fair, there's a big difference towards the end of the mix, because in this one, drum's quite loud. Drum and bass actually pulled back. The rhythm section's actually pulled back in that mix. It's not in this one, so it stays the same. It is pulled back some in this version, but not in this. The kick in this is a lot tighter. I spent some time really working on that, and that while the first one has you can see a lot of extension when the kick hits, there's a lot of whoomp underneath it. I really got rid of that in this. Pushed the kick a lot higher. The bass is driven a bit, and I think that's possibly pulled some of the lows out of that bass. Maybe that's why this one isn't quite as busy down here. But again, I'm quite aggressive with a high-pass filter. Maybe a little too much, but at the same time, the mixes that I do are very clear and very transparent, which means that they don't end up sounding muddy. One of the concerns that I have is that when I do mixes like these warm mixes, is that they seem great to start with, but then when I go away and listen to them as music, I feel like they're a bit kludgy. So without having a professional, like a real professional, say to me, hey, look, this is what I would do here, it's hard to say what's right or wrong. Where I have approached professionals, they've said, no, like they're really nice mixes. I have sometimes been told, oh, well, I would use more bass. But then I listen to their mixes and I sort of go, well, your mixes just aren't like my mixes. And that's fine. You know, you've put a lot of bass in, but I just wouldn't do it that way because that's not how I hear music. So that comes down to personal taste, which one or two of them have acknowledged as well. They've said, well, yes, but that's a personal choice. You know, I will tend to make a mix that seems a little bit more like something out of the 80s, even though I am heavier on bass than things were back then. But I don't feel the need to have these, you know, great big mounds of bass in the bottom end, which most people want to hear. That becomes a personal choice. So Reaper is incredibly powerful technically, but I found it a chore to use because, as I said, everything is hard to find. It may have lots of options, but everything feels very greebly. In contrast, Tracktion's waveform is a little cleaner, a little clearer, a little cartoony at times, but surprisingly similar to Reaper. But I think that there's become this great sort of sameness about Cubase, probably Logic, Studio One, to a fair extent, Bitwig as well. Bitwig does some things differently, which is very cool, but I think when it gets into the mix space, they kind of all do exactly the same thing, which is that very pretty looking mixer, although Bitwig's mix sliders don't seem very, well, they're a little the same on Tracktion's waveform. They're a little like kind of nothing there. I know it's just a skin, but they don't feel like they're a mix engineer's space. I think Studio One probably does a lovely job in the idea of feeling like a mix engineer's space, but I haven't been able to use it because there's no demo. They've got a Prime version, which is free, but again, so limited as to make it useless in comparison. Great if you're starting out and you say, oh, I just want a really lean entry to the DAW market, then nothing wrong with Studio One Prime at all. But if you're saying I'm going to want to fly in my VST and what have you, then you're nowhere. Coming back into Reason is just so nice. It's a light interface, so I can see things clean and clear. While I have most of the desk shut down and I don't tend to use the dynamics in here, I will put them out into the rack. But that visibility of everything within the rack is, to me, just such a wonderful thing that I can have a thing here. So if I do insert something or have something after an instrument, I can see it easily. Like, it's much nicer seeing this, even though I can't see the whole plugin, than it is seeing nothing but just a little squished name. And sometimes if it's a long plugin name, it's so squished it's completely unreadable. And I know that people complain, and my old poor tired eyes feel sometimes a little bit like Reason's a bit, but Reaper is so incredibly tiny and greebly for no purpose. So yes, big frustration in those environments where it's like, there's better ways of doing it. There's easier ways to see the information. Let me just pull this into here. The mixer, like I said, I keep most of these things closed because I'll use them elsewhere, but the EQ I use through this system. So this is great because I can have this on and it's visual and I can see what's going on, and it's very visible and it's very musical. It's a nice shape. Exactly how it compares to a real SSL, who knows, who cares. But the mixer is very clean and it makes perfect sense. The fact that your FX sends are there and they default to minus 12 dB is so much better. I felt like I spent a lot of time having to set everything up. I don't know, everyone goes, oh, you can use templates, but you know what? Once you get your template too full of stuff, it starts to become a pain in the ass. I use templates in that I have some basic things that appear, but not like other people do, and not like I feel like I would need in those other DAWs. So the cleanliness and the clarity of this, and the fact that it's a live interface, I even tried coming back into this to switch into the dark interface, and it was just like, nah, too hard, too unclear. So, and the fact that this really does feel like a real mixer, and even though these channels, the mixed channels, are much narrower than in many of the other DAWs, they then can be nice and wide with lots of stuff all over them, but boy, is it hard to feel like you can access the information or use them. So this is a far more elegant use of space overall. So that's a really nice thing. Plus, this sequencer, I know people say that the Reason sequencer sucks, it's not doing this, that, and the other, but you know what? There was no other system that I used that was anywhere near as clear as this. Most of them have got far too much stuff visible, and it just makes it complex. Black backgrounds with, you know, like a million divisions between the bars. I don't want that. I absolutely don't want that. I get that other people do, and that's fine. They're entitled to it. But I found it incredibly hard to just set my points because I mean, I came into this one knowing where everything was. You know, when somebody sends me a mix they've made in their DAW and I just get stems, and especially if they don't tell me the BPM and what have you, it's hard to find where those points are. But it's still not too hard in Reason, especially once I've got it locked to tempo. It's relatively easy to go, okay, that's where my section points are, and I can loop them. It's easy. Or I've got to make decisions, especially if I end up having to make arrangement type decisions. It's easy. But it didn't matter what I did in the other DAWs. It just felt very hard and complex and kludgy and unclear. So wonderful things about Reason. And it's interesting that with that clarity of vision, There's a purpose to saying, well, with that clarity of vision comes a clarity of sound. So a clarity of vision and clarity of sound seem to go hand in hand for some reason. So you could kind of hear where I felt like I could clearly see what was going on. And that's an interesting thing. While these may seem warmer in some ways, and this is just distorted, I couldn't feel like I really ever knew what was going on. I couldn't get an overview at all. And yeah, I think the mixers have certain things that are nice about them. But are they as clear? Are they as good a mix? Are they as radio friendly? Bearing in mind this music is not radio friendly. Yeah, I don't think they are. This is. So interesting things about each mix that came out. But the big thing that I came to in the end was, yes, I am mixing a lot cleaner and brighter in Reason, but I'm mixing a lot clearer. And clear mixing has always been an important thing for me. Don't entirely know why. It's not like I'm a perfectionist when it comes to that kind of stuff, but I love clarity. I love being able to have a mix that feels kind of transparent back to front, and I feel like front to back. Those other DAW mixes don't have the depth to them, and that depth and clarity can make the mix feel a little less oomphy initially, but I think over time there's better depth, definitely better clarity in the Reason-based mix. So very interesting. Each person will use what works for them, but just quite interesting to use other DAWs and to remind myself really, again, how wonderful Reason actually is for the clarity, the lack of kludge or mess everywhere, the tremendous ability to see what's going on, especially over 3 monitors. The other DAWs don't tend to behave as well over multiple monitors. Bitwig seems to. It's specially designed with systems that spread your screens out, and that's really very cool, very clever. But the others, not quite so much. They're sometimes prone to having issues and hiding windows. So you struggle, especially where I used the Reason rack inside Reaper, because I got sick of trying to struggle to get things done. I was like, I'm just going to use the devices I know. And to be honest, it kept disappearing underneath. Actually, no, sorry, that was in Tracktion. It kept disappearing underneath, and I'm having to go down into the Windows bar to pull Windows back to the front, which I never have to do with Reason. Yes, there are some annoyances sometimes with VST, that obviously if you don't pin them to stay open, but once you pin them to stay open, they tend to stay open, with the exception of when you go click on other screens, that can get confusing, but it's overall a bit more consistent. So yeah, hopefully that's of some interest to you. 2A. Realise that there is no perfect or one way that a track can be mixed, and that interestingly sometimes it is worth pulling your mix down and having a go again, or exporting to stems and going again, because I'm tempted to go back to my first official mix and pull in what I did with that string, because as a string comes in, I think that's magnificent, and something that I failed to manage to get right in the first go. So redoing mixes is cool. Getting a different perspective out of a different DAW is, well, for me, frustrating, but it is kind of cool too, because it's brought me back around to say, okay, how does this all compare? To remind yourself through using other DAWs how good the DAW that you have chosen to live with probably really is, you know, and how comfortable you have gotten with it. And that ultimately they all do sound the same as each other. And while there may be a lot of marketing to try and draw you into, you need this DAW because it's better, it's actually not. You need to find the workflow that works for you, reasons of workflow that works for me, and don't doubt that. Be comfortable and allow yourself to have your sound. I've got a sound. Reason seems to work with me to help me get that sound. I know before I settled in Reason, and the reason I ended up settling back into Reason, because I was using it before, is because I found I was more likely to get the sounds that I wanted. Not just because of the synths or whatever, but the overall mix sound. I always felt like I struggled in other DAWs, and that they would, as I said, feel kind of kludgy. But that's to a great extent because I feel kludged from, I'm looking at this thing going, this is a bit of a nightmare for me because I can't see anything. I don't feel like I'm in control of the mix at all. It feels like the DAW is some kind of evil leprechaun that's always hiding stuff from me. Whereas Reason, there just isn't that feeling. And so I get the clean, clear, what people might say are two shiny mixes that I'm looking for. And that's my thing. That's what I want. And I get them. So interesting video. May or may not have interested you, but it was a fascinating process for me to go through. If you have any questions, ask them down below. If you're looking to have mix work done, please either start talking to me, probably not below because that's a public thing and sometimes it's hard for me to see YouTube things, but track me down probably through Facebook or on my website, which will be linked down below, and start a conversation with me. You have a great day now.